So in this video, we are going to be talking about how the Federal Reserve lost control over the interest rates, inflation, the economy, and everything else going on, which I don't really believe. However, most of the people within the markets, within the mainstream media, they have no clue of what it is that the Federal Reserve is doing. And since the Federal Reserve doesn't clearly talk about it as far as their strategies go, it makes it very confusing for most people out there when they think about what it is that the Federal Reserve is attempting to do. Now, most of the narrative that you would hear out there is that inflation is too high and the Federal Reserve is trying to bring that inflation down to a 2% target, and that the inflation is stubborn and that they can't bring it down to the 2% target, and so therefore they're going to have to keep interest rates elevated going into the future to make up for the fact that they can't get that inflation down. Like, this is pretty common out there as far as what is being told. However, the Federal Reserve strategy for literally decades now has something very different in mind on what it is that they are looking for when it comes to their inflationary scenario. Now, a lot of you who have been following me on my channel for any length of time have heard me refer to a bunch of different speeches here on this channel. Now, one of those speeches in particular that I really like to just constantly hammer on is John Williams' speech, Monetary Policy for a Low Neutral Interest Rate World. Now, I left a link down in the description for this particular speech, so you can go and check it out for yourself. Now, something in that speech that was stated by John Williams, now we have to think, John Williams is the New York Fed president. He's been there for a very long time. He is incredibly influential. When it comes to monetary policy and what it is that the Federal Reserve is attempting to do, this particular speech is so telling. I mean, it is like incredibly telling on what it is that is now taking place, because in this speech, this is what he had to say. He said, "Today we face an altogether different set of problems stemming from a very low neutral interest rate. That is, the short-term real interest rate consistent with an economy operating at its potential alongside low and stable inflation. Ironically, the problem we need to solve these days is the risk of inflation that is persistently too low rather than too high." So now think about that. He said ironically, right? The problem that they need to solve is a risk of inflation that is too low. This is their problem. It's too low rather than too high, meaning that he would rather have monetary policy facing a problem of too high of an inflationary scenario rather than too low. So now here we are in a situation within the economy in which that inflation is too high, right? It's got this elevated inflation, stubbornly high, won't come down to the 2% target, and this is forcing the Federal Reserve to have to put out information that says, hey, we may not be cutting rates going into the future. This has markets flipping out. People are losing their mind over this. But if you think about it for just a minute, right now, the Federal Reserve is positioned exactly the way they want to be. Even look at the article I left down in the description to, I think it came out of Reuters originally, and I think Yahoo picked it up or something. But just go and read that article. It's interviewing John Williams, and he says right there in that interview, in that article, that the Federal Reserve is in a good place. Like, I can't remember exactly how it's quoted. I don't have it here in front of me. But he said something about the fact that that policy is in a good place. Like, this is where they want to be. And this is according to what they were talking about literally years ago. So now when we think about this particular speech and what it is that he was referencing, talking about the neutral interest rate being very low, inflation expectation was low, and this interfering with their monetary policy, having an elevated inflation expectation literally gives them the ability to then have their monetary policy in a position in which that they can now use it to try and deal with the economy. When the Fed funds rate is near zero, it's no longer an effective tool. They can't use it because there's no more adjusting. You can't go past zero, like zero is it. I mean, there is theories out there that you can go into a negative interest rate or something, but for the most part, there is no proof that negative interest rates actually work within the economy. Now, something else written within this speech to try and deal with the scenario, right, this inflationary scenario, this is what John Williams had to say. average inflation targeting, whereby the central bank purposefully aims to achieve an above target inflation rate in good times, when the lower bound is not constrained. Properly designed and implemented, such an overshoot can offset the inflation undershoot during bad times, so that the long run average inflation rate and inflation expectations are in line with the target. See, this is what the Federal Reserve is trying to do. They're going for an average inflation rate over time. This is explained within the Federal Reserve's own statements, and John Williams had predicted this back in 2018. Now, it was just a few years later that we get COVID, and Powell steps up and has this to say. Let me bring it up here. And again, this is coming from August of 2020. Prior, this is before the inflation hit. Remember this. This is August of 2020. COVID has just hit and people are just now losing their minds. They haven't experienced the inflationary scenario. This is before the quantitative easing and all the stimulus packages and all that other stuff. This is what Jerome Powell had to say. Again, this is August of 2020. The persistent undershoot of inflation from our 2% long-run objective is a cause for concern. Many find it counterintuitive that the Fed would want to push up inflation. Well, wait a minute here. John Williams was having a hard time even finding inflation, even though there was quantitative easing 1, 2, 3, and 4 from 2008 going all the way to 2018. Inflation was nowhere to be found. Many find it counterintuitive that the Fed would want to push up inflation. They tried to push up inflation. They couldn't get it. Like quantitative easing 1, 2, 3, and 4 was meant to push up inflation. And there was no inflation, right? This is like, it was not even, a year before this was stated. This speech came out that Donald Trump was saying there was no inflation. The Fed should be printing money, right? So now when the Federal Reserve says in this speech, many find it counterintuitive that the Fed would want to push up inflation. Now, in my mind, I'm thinking, how would you push it up? You've been trying to get inflation for the last 10 years and failed to do it. But yet, somehow you're going to miraculously find inflation. After all, low and stable inflation is essential for a well-functioning economy. And we are certainly mindful that higher prices for essential items, such as food, gasoline, and shelter, add to the burdens faced by many families, especially those struggling with lost jobs and incomes. However, inflation that is persistently too low can pose serious risks to the economy. Inflation that runs below its desired level can lead to an unwelcome fall in long-term inflation expectations, which in turn can pull actual inflation even lower, resulting in an adverse cycle of ever lower inflation and inflation expectations. Now again, this is coming from Jerome Powell in August of 2020. He's very concerned about having too low of inflation and that they would want to push up inflation. He even says it. Many people would find it counterintuitive that they would want to push up inflation. He goes on to say further down in the speech, let me get it. All right. So, he goes on to say this. This is later in the speech, and all these links are all down in the description, so you can go and read it all for yourself. Again, this isn't my information. This is coming directly from the Federal Reserve itself, right? Most people don't recognize this stuff because they don't go back in time and actually read some of the statements or remember that this was stated back in the day. Like they just simply forget about it and move on, right? But I don't forget. Like you say them words, I'm going to remember them, right? This is what it has to say. However, if inflation runs below 2% following economic downturns but never moves above 2% even when the economy is strong, then over time, inflation will average less than 2%. Households and businesses will come to expect this result, meaning that inflation expectations would tend to move below our inflation goal and pull realized inflation down. Now think about that. Donald Trump End of his administration. There's no inflation. The Fed should be printing money. I should fire Jerome Powell. He should be listening to me and printing money. Germany's doing it right by going negative. This is all things that Donald Trump was saying at the time. Right? Now, the problems that they were facing was a too low of inflation. Right? John Williams was talking about it back in 2018, and here it is being reiterated by Powell in August of 2020, just before the inflationary scenario hit. Right? Found it weird that the Fed would want it, right? Counterintuitive, the Fed would want to push up inflation. Like here they were for the previous 10 years and couldn't do it. So he says here, to prevent this outcome and adverse dynamics, talking about the persistently low inflation and bringing realized inflation and inflation expectations down, to prevent this outcome and adverse dynamics that could ensue, our new statement, the Fed's new statement, right? Many people don't realize that the Fed had a new statement 4 years ago when this speech came out, right? The new statement indicates that we will seek to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time. Therefore, following periods when inflation has been running below 2%, appropriate monetary policy will likely aim to achieve inflation moderately above 2% for some time. In seeking to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time, we are not tying ourselves to a particular mathematical formula that defines the average. Thus, our approach could be viewed as a flexible form of average inflation targeting. Flexible average inflation targeting, FAIT, FAIT. This is really coming from the Federal Reserve. Look it up, Flexible Average Inflation Targeting Federal Reserve, and you will find this. You will find this information. Most people don't know to look for it. They don't know it exists. If you don't know it exists, why would you look for it? Right? If you believe that it's a 2% target and you have been confirmed that it's a 2% target because of every single mainstream media article has confirmed that into your mind, into your beliefs, that they are going for a 2% target, why would you look for flexible average inflation targeting information? You wouldn't. You wouldn't know it exists. You just wouldn't know. Goes on to say, our decision about appropriate monetary policy will continue to reflect a broad array of considerations and will not be dictated by any formula. Right? All these people who think that they know what the Federal Reserve is doing, that they know that they got their 2% target, they know how they're figuring it all out. Federal Reserve don't. Federal Reserve doesn't have a mathematical formula for figuring it out, so it makes me wonder how it is that all these economists and all these people out there who seem to be experts on the Federal Reserve's monetary policy, they have a mathematical formula for figuring it out, but the Fed doesn't, and they're the ones who are in charge of monetary policy. Doesn't that seem strange? All right, doesn't it? I mean, I find that strange. Of course, if excessive inflationary pressures were to build or inflation expectations were to ratchet above levels consistent with our goal, we will not hesitate to act. So moderately above 2% seems to be right in line with what it is that they were saying. John Williams just recently said that they were in a good place with their monetary policy. So now, how does this all work? How is it that they were able to pull this off? To be able to conduct themselves in a way that is now completely obscure from everybody else's view. Like they have no idea what the Federal Reserve is up to when it comes to the average inflation targeting and how it is that they are conducting themselves when it comes to the monetary policy, because most people are looking at the interest rate adjustments being the monetary policy. And that when they adjust rates, that's the policy. The communication about the policy is the policy. All right, now I'm going to share this one. How much time? Okay, we're 15 minutes into it. I'm trying not to make this a really long video because it's already kind of confusing as it is, right? So here we are going to go to, let me see, where is it at? Oops. Oh, why can't I find it now? There we go. All right, so now we're going to go to Ben Bernanke's speech. All right, Ben Bernanke's speech talking about deflation and how to prevent it from ever occurring here. Now this speech is probably one of the most telling speeches that the Federal Reserve was going to lose their monetary policy. They were going to be losing their ability to adjust interest rates through the Fed funds rate. That's their monetary policy. They were about ready to lose it. They knew it. They knew it was coming, right? And they said, that's okay. Here's what he has to say. And this is again, I left links down in the description for all this stuff so you can go and read it for yourself. I am not making this stuff up. This is exactly how the Federal Reserve is conducting themselves through their own words. This is what he has to say. And I know a lot of people are looking at it saying, dude, we're not even near the lower bound anymore. That doesn't matter. Monetary policy was at the lower bound for like 10 years. Right, better than 10 years. During that time, they developed a way to conduct themselves without the use of the adjustments of the Fed funds rate. That's the important part to understand. That their monetary policy went from the adjustment of the Fed funds rate to the speaking of the Fed funds rate. It's so important to understand that. This is one of the reasons why you saw like mortgage rates coming down all throughout 2024. Because of the credible threat that came at the end of 2023. At the end of 2023, the Federal Reserve had put information out there to the mainstream media that there was going to be an intense amount of interest rate cuts coming all throughout 2024. People started acting accordingly to that. The moment that they cut rates, the moment that the Fed cut rates, mortgages started going up. Mortgage interest rates started going up. Completely opposite of what it is that everybody was anticipating. And now if you take into consideration that the adjustment of interest rates is no longer the effective tool, but the speaking of what's taking place is more of the actual tool for impacting the economy, then you'll start making sense that when the Federal Reserve goes to lower rates, that's a bad sign. That's bad economic times. And so since people look at that and say, man, that's like stimulating effect there, right? The idea behind it's not really stimulating, but the idea behind it is that they're attempting to do something to deal with the fact that the economy is not doing well. That's why they're cutting rates. When that happens, people get really concerned. This is the reason why we saw mortgage rates moving completely opposite of the Federal Reserve when most people thought when the Fed cuts rates, the mortgage rates are going to come down. All right? So this is the problem that most people are now facing. If you don't look at the Fed funds rates and the cutting of Fed funds rates to be the tool, then you can step back and listen to the communications about it and watch the markets. Because the communication about the interest rate adjustments has a profound impact into the markets. And eventually into the economy, as most people are making decisions on a longer term basis and not by the seat of their pants like a lot of people seem to think the Fed is. Okay, 333 people watching. Thank you so much for joining in. Okay, so now I'm going to get back to this Ben Bernanke speech here real quick so that we can really understand how this is operating, how they use their words, right, to conduct themselves. Because this is what Ben Bernanke had to say. And again, this is a speech from 2001. I mean, we're talking 23 years ago now. But this is what he has to say. As I have mentioned, some observers have concluded that when the central bank's policy rate falls to zero, its practical minimum, monetary policy loses its ability to further stimulate aggregate demand and the economy. Right there, he admitted it, right? Ben Bernanke straight up says it, that when monetary policy hits the lower bound of zero, that their monetary policy, loses its ability to further stimulate aggregate demand in the economy. That's it. It's over. At a broad conceptual level, and in my view, in practice as well, this conclusion is clearly mistaken. Well, now, whoa, wait a minute. You're telling, Ben Bernanke is saying that once you have hit the lower bound of zero and monetary policy is no longer, how does he put it, loses its ability to further stimulate aggregate demand, that they have, in a broad conceptual level, in my view and practice as well, this conclusion is clearly mistaken, saying that they have now broken their monetary policies. No. If you're at the lower bound of zero and you can't adjust monetary policy anymore through the Fed funds rate, right, through the adjustment of interest rates, that's not a problem, right? You're mistaken if you think that monetary policy can't continue. He goes on to say, indeed, under a fiat, that is paper money system, a government in practice, the central bank in cooperation with other agencies should always be able to increase nominal spending and inflation, even when the short-term nominal interest rate is at zero. Whoa, curing deflation. This is Ben Bernanke talking about curing deflation and trying to figure out a way that they could stimulate aggregate demand when the Fed funds rate has hit zero and the adjustment of Fed funds rate is no longer an effective tool. He says that's okay. They got a plan. They got plan, right? What's that plan? Even when the short-term nominal interest rate is at zero? It goes like this. Here's the plan. The conclusion that deflation is always reversible under a fiat money system follows from basic economic reasoning. A little parable may prove useful. He says this, today, now remember this is back in 2001, today an ounce of gold sells for $300 more or less. Now suppose that a modern alchemist solves his subject's oldest problem by finding a way to produce unlimited amounts of new gold at essentially no cost. Moreover, his invention is widely publicized, right? His invention is widely publicized and scientifically verified. And he announces his intention to begin massive production of gold within days. So think about this. If the invention is widely publicized and scientifically verified, and he announces this to be taking place in the near future, right? This is what Ben Bernanke is talking about using this is the monetary policy. Remember, like the Fed funds rate is hit zero. That's not an effective tool, adjusting rates. So he says, that's okay. We don't need that. Let's talk about this gold machine for just a minute. All right? Producing massive production of gold within days. What would happen to the price of gold? Presumably, the potentially unlimited supply of cheap gold would cause the market price of gold to plummet. Indeed, if the market for gold is to any degree efficient, the price of gold would collapse immediately after the announcement of the invention, before the alchemists had produced and marketed a single ounce of the yellow metal. You see what Ben Bernanke was describing here? He's describing a gold machine that's going to bring in an unlimited supply of gold, causing the market price to plummet, and it's all based off of information of something that doesn't even exist yet. Right? This is how the Federal Reserve conducts themselves. Now they figured it out. They figured out how to do this communication. And this is, again, I don't know if I left this particular speech down in the description. Right? But this is communicating about monetary policy, and I will get this. If I haven't put this link, I don't think I did. If I didn't put this particular link for this speech down in the description, when I get done uploading this video, I will grab that speech and I will put it down in the description, because this one is also incredibly important to understand. Because 20 years ago, when Ben Bernanke talked about that gold machine and how it is that they were going to prevent deflation from occurring and tried to create an inflationary scenario, literally using their words, a lot of times people can say, well, dude, that was 2 decades ago, right? How is it that this information is really relevant today? Well, this is the thing, communicating about monetary policy. Now, this is Philip Jefferson, and this, again, FOMC, Federal Open Market Committee member. This was given May 13th of 2024. So we're talking like, 7 months ago. Excuse me. So it wasn't even that long ago. And this is what he had to say in here. In this speech, this is coming from the speech, it says this. In 1981, Karl Brunner, the Swiss monetary economist, called central banking an esoteric art and lamented central banks' inherent inherent impossibility to articulate its insight in an explicit and intelligible words and sentences. Basically saying that the Federal Reserve cannot communicate. They don't know how to communicate, and even if they did communicate it, nobody would understand what the hell they are saying anyway. That's what this particular guy was saying, this Karl Brunner from the Swiss Monetary Economist in 1981. This is what he said. At the time, central banking wisdom dictated that monetary policymakers should say as little as possible. Keep quiet. Don't tell anybody. Be as quiet as possible. Right? This is what he was saying that monetary policy makers should do. Some research of that vintage tried to rationalize this secrecy through the notion that monetary policy would be particularly effective if it surprised the markets. That's how the Federal Reserve used to conduct themselves. You would just wake up one day and the Fed had adjusted rates and nobody knew it was coming. And all of a sudden, it was like this shock and awe event. They had to all of a sudden take this information and deal with it one day because the Federal Reserve didn't communicate that it was going to happen. Goes on to say, he goes on to say this in this speech. He goes on to say this. Thank you for the super chat. I'll go and check that out here in just a second. I won't forget about you. All right. And this is what the speech goes on to say. Expectations become a focal point in academic and policy circles with the emergence of the new Keynesian model in 1990 as a framework for monetary policy. This is important to understand, right? New Keynesian models in the 90s for a framework for monetary policy. In these models, aligning the expectations of decision makers in the private sector with those of policymakers produce superior economic outcomes. Now, if you missed what he was saying there, basically aligning what it is that the Federal Reserve is wanting for their policy and communicating that out there to align everybody who is going to be making decisions in the economy to that they are in the same page. Okay? That's, again, in these models, aligning the expectations of decision makers in the private sector, right? The decision makers in the private, with those of the policymakers, right? You align these two together, produce superior outcomes. It goes on to say this. Mike Woodford, one of the developers of this new Keynesian model, put it this way. Not only do expectations about policy matter, but very little else matters. See how this gold machine works? See, they talked about it 20 years ago. This speech was only 7 months ago. And what are they talking about? How not only do expectations about policy matter, but very little else does. Nothing, very little else matters. The adjustment of interest rates doesn't matter as much as the communication about it. Expectations about policy matter. Very little else does. Goes on to say this. During the tenure of Chairman Bernanke, there was another burst of innovation in the way that monetary policy was communicated. You see this? Ben Bernanke was talking about it, right? The gold machine? Saying that, hey, we need to communicate what it is that we intend for our policy going into the future in order to conduct ourselves, since the monetary policy of the Fed funds rate had hit zero. We can't use that anymore. We have to be able to communicate. And we never really communicated before. Right? This is what Ben Bernanke and the Federal Reserve was saying. We never communicated before. How do we do this? Well, in 2007, it took the first steps with the first Statement on Economic Projections, the SEP, Statement on Economic Projections. Okay, the first SEP was published to convey systematically the economic outlook of the FOMC participants. So they developed a communication tool. In 2011, Chairman Bernanke started holding press conferences after every other FOMC meeting. In 2012, the Fed adopted an explicit inflation target of 2% and started publishing individual FOMC participants' view on the appropriate future path of the Fed funds rate, now known famously as the dot plot. See how they developed these tools to communicate it to you? They never talked about it before, but the SEP came up with this idea back in 2007. It was like, hey, we need to convey what it is that the FOMC participants are saying. And then we need to start publishing statements after every other FOMC meeting. And we need to tell the people that we're going for a 2% target. This has all taken place in 2012 or shortly around there, right? 2007 to 2012. They were developing the communication styles. They knew, right? They knew that they had to do this because the monetary policy was going to hit the lower bound. Ben Bernanke talked about it in 2001, getting ready for the situation that was coming. All right, now famously known as the dot plot. Okay, during these years, Loretta Mester, many of you who follow the Federal Reserve know who Loretta Mester is, very popular Fed official from the Philadelphia Bank. Right here it says, okay. In her capacity as the research director at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, contributed to ongoing work on communications in collaboration with policymakers and the Federal Reserve Board staff. See, they continued to figure out how it was that they were going to communicate this information out there. Because this is how they conduct themselves, is by getting this information out there and then having people understanding what it is that the Federal Reserve is intending on doing, right? And then conducting themselves in a line with what it is that the Federal Reserve is trying to communicate. So if the Federal Reserve is communicating that out there, that is the monetary policy taking place. Not that adjustment. Everybody says, oh, they're communicating about the monetary policy. They're not communicating about it. When they communicate, that is it. That is the policy. Okay? Goes on to say here, of course, this was an extraordinary time for monetary policy as interest rates in most advanced economies were close to zero. Right? This was an extraordinary time for monetary policy as interest rates in most advanced economies were close to zero following the Great Financial Crisis. The FOMC employed forward guidance, explicit communications about the future path of the policy rate, as a key tool to deal with the unprecedented situation. The research community have found that such forward guidance could be very effective in the context of the new Keynesian paradigm. You can go on and read more about this. Speeches are all down in the description. This stuff is really taking place in a way that most people have no clue about. They have missed it. They missed the gold machine. They don't understand how the Federal Reserve had lost control through the Fed funds adjustments, or through the adjustment of the Fed funds rate. That is no longer the effective tool. The key policy tool is their words. The future expectation of what it is that they plan on doing with the Fed funds rate. Now, something I find very interesting is a lot of times people will say, bro, dude, the Fed funds rate are far off of zero, right? They don't need to use this forward guidance. They can actually adjust rates now. They can't. Right? They can't, because the adjustment of interest rates to stimulate the economy means that they would have to be able to drop rates far enough below the neutral interest rate in order to stimulate the economy. Even if they were to take rates to zero today, it would not be enough below the neutral rate to stimulate the economy. They are using their words. They are using their words to deal with the economy. Think about how on fire the markets have been. Like all these people talking about how awesome the stock market is going up and all this stuff, right? Based off of the idea of what it is that the Federal Reserve was doing. Like the Federal Reserve said, hey, we are cutting rates going into the future, right? And all of a sudden, everybody's getting all excited about the idea of, rate cuts coming to the future. And then the moment that they say, hey, we're not going to maybe cut as much as we thought going into the future, and then the markets lose their mind and they sell off. Right? And so you have these wild swings that are taking place off of this communication, and then you step back and you look at it and you say, well, wait a minute here, they hardly have done anything at all. Like the Federal Reserve did bring rates down on the Fed funds level, half a rate point, quarter point, another quarter point. Right? So they are adjusting rates, but it's not like it's significant. And it's not like it's been a very long time since they've done it, which would then allow those lower rates to then impact the economy. Literally nothing has happened from the adjustment of rates. The lag time has not been long enough for that to actually impact the economy, but look at the way the people are reacting to it. And then look at how it is that the Federal Reserve can stimulate the economy, create this stock market rally through their words, through a small credible threat of interest rate adjustments, and then completely unwind the entire thing right? Or at least the market's perception of it, and whether it actually unwound it, but unwind the market perception of what's taken place simply by a credible threat of less cuts coming into the future. You see how this communication is impacting the people in an incredible way? Like, to me, it's obvious. Like, I don't see it any other way. Every communication, the way that the people are anticipating the future, the narrative that is being spoken out there, all that to me is the important information that then has monetary policy moving in a particular direction. As most people are not focused on the communication of it, but the reality of the rate cuts, they miss it. They miss everything, and then they wonder how come it is that they don't understand the Federal Reserve and how it is that the Federal Reserve has lost control and they don't know what they're doing and all this other stuff. That's the narrative that they have to take, because they just don't understand that the Federal Reserve is using their words. That's it. All right? And so most people are looking for the action to be the reality of the situation. The reality is their narrative, the way that they communicate that out there to the people and the way that they receive that information. Again, it's the gold machine. It's the Federal Reserve's gold machine that they invented to stimulate the economy using their words, described by Ben Bernanke over 20 years ago. All right. Okay, let's go check out that super chat, and then I got to go back to work. What time is it? Yeah, I got to go back to work after I read the super chat. Sorry, guys, I kind of took too much time babbling on about this, but this information isn't easy to get out and understand to its fullest. Like, if I just gave you a little section of it, it wouldn't make sense in its complete form. Happy holidays, UE. Thanks for the encouraging me to pull the trigger on my first house earlier this year. Felt very lucky to refinance it for 6.1 a day before the rate cut this year. Well, thank you so much, Neo Torino, I love the name. Thank you very much for the $10 super chat. Very supportive of the channel. I really appreciate that. Thank you everybody who joined in on today's live stream with 384 people watching and 122 likes. Thank you so much for hitting that like button. Thank you for sharing the video. Yesterday's video was very popular. It got many views. I think it was up to like 26,000 views it got over the last 24 hours, which is just incredible. Thank you so much for sharing the video and getting this information out there. What else can I say? Links are down in the description. Uneducated Economist. You guys let me know.